Hi everyone, thank you for having me. Thank you for putting on an Owasp event at such short notice and getting such a good crowd as well. It's really nice to see such a good turnout. My name is Scott Helme, that's what I look like. You can find all the research and all the things that I talk about on my blog at scotthelme.co.uk. I'm also quite active on Twitter. I do a lot of security research in my spare time, which is how I first fell into the field. And what I'm going to talk about today is some research that I was involved in last year with a fellow security researcher, Troy Hunt, if anyone, I'm sure many of you have heard of him, in hacking the Nissan Leaf. Now, Troy found out about this through one of his workshops, and we just happened to meet up like the day after he found out about this, and I had one of these vehicles outside. So there was a lot of kind of nice coincidences in this, in that I had one of the vehicles to test with, as Anders mentioned in his, and we saw in the video with Chris and Charlie. When you're just two guys with one car, you can only really test that car, but we're quite fortunate that I actually had one. So my car was the donor vehicle for all of the research that you're about to look at. So to try and get some of the Q&A out of the way up front, yes, I do own a Nissan Leaf. Mine's a better colour than that, but I do drive an electric car. No, it's not a milk float. No, it isn't slow. Lots of people ask me about the battery, so if you're into your electronics or your hardware, they do have a very big battery in them. I could probably run your house for 3 or 4 days on my battery pack alone. They take in seriously large amounts of power when you charge these things. Again, electronics or hardware people here will appreciate what 50 kilowatts of DC power is. So these are pretty serious toys that we're playing around with. People always ask me how far it drives, so 70 to 100 miles. I can't convert that to kilometers, I apologise. And then the next question is always, how much does it cost to charge? £2.30 is how much, so it's about €0.50 at the minute. No, it's about €3 at the minute. So hopefully that's most of the Q&A out of the way. One of the things that first kind of encouraged me to buy one of these cars, a lot of people typically think of it as like an eco decision to go electric. It was actually just because it was cheap and they're quite fast. But one of the really nice things that we liked was something called the CarWings application. This was a smartphone application that actually came with the car. And as Anders mentioned in his, sometimes they just have a couple of convenience or kind of lazy features. And the one that really sold it for us, we live in the north of England where it's cold and snows a lot, is that you can control the climate control from the application. So you could wake up in the morning, look outside, it's frozen solid, covered in snow, and you could just turn the heating on and the car would defrost itself and be nice and warm. This was a huge selling point for us for the car. It does lots of other courtesy things as well, so you can look how much power you have, control the charging, but mainly this application was one of the biggest attractions, especially when I had to sell the expensive car to my wife as an idea. Behind the application was an XML API. Being kind of a technology/security enthusiast and buying a car like this, the first thing that I wanted to do was kind of tear it apart and have a look at it. But when I got my Leaf about 2 years ago now, they'd already been around for 5 years. And a lot of people that had EVs at that time were kind of enthusiasts and early adopters and tech people again. So the API was actually really well documented online already, to the point where you could pretty much download like a full kind of schematic of the API. The information was already pretty much out there. And as a result of that, it was largely fully reversed. There were even some kind of custom implementations in different languages to interact with the API directly. And the main thing that I was interested in, a lot of these other people had kind of built their own little widgets or scripts where they could interact with the air conditioning and then tie it into like a button on a Raspberry Pi on their table. So they were interested in kind of making it more convenient. My interest was purely from a security perspective. I wanted to figure out how to get in and how to break this thing. Fortunately, this was largely secure actually. Unfortunately, depending on your perspective there. It was largely secure. There was one thing that I found where the API was talking over an insecure channel, but they patched that out. But it was secure. I couldn't find a way to get into this. I couldn't find a way, despite spending quite a bit of time on this, to actually abuse the API that sat behind the CarWings application. And to give you an overview of how this works, you have the application on your smartphone, and that talks HTTPS to a server that Nissan themselves hosted and ran. And again, going back to Anders' talk, I was really hoping that we would have direct comms at the vehicle here. I was hoping that we could communicate directly with the vehicle, but Nissan stand one of their servers in between as a proxy, and that gives them some ability to control and protect the car by limiting the information that you can send to it. And again, going back to Anders' talk, as he said again, when you interact with the Nissan API and try and perform an action in the smartphone application, their servers will send an SMS to the car to wake the car up. It will then dial home on the communications modem and then pull back down the command that you wanted to send to the car. And I know this because if you dismantle the front half of the inside of your car, there's something in there called the TCU, which is the Telematics Communications Unit. Inside that is a SIM card. If you pull that SIM card out and put it into a phone, it registers to the provider's network, to whoever you are near at that time. It registers with an international phone number, and then if I activate some kind of action in the application, the phone number receives an SMS. And I got quite excited at that point because I thought, oh, maybe, it's like an SMS for do this, do that, X command, Y command, but it wasn't. It was a generic wake-up command, as Anders said again. So even though I had the phone number for the car, being able to send commands via SMS was not possible. But there was another kind of problem here as well that Nissan had, and it was that they were absolutely terrible at keeping this API online. When you're the gatekeeper between the smartphone and the vehicle, if your API goes down, then all of the functionality in the application immediately stops working. And this happened a lot. Nissan really sold the vehicle, especially to us, on a lot of these kind of remote controlled features in the application, and most owners found out that 50% of the time straight away, it didn't work. Then the rest of the time, you'd turn on the heating, it wouldn't turn on. You'd go to work, and then it'd turn on in the middle of the day when you're at work, like 4 hours later. And it was absolutely terrible. I really hope there's no one from Nissan here. So they got a lot of flack for this, and in the end, they finally decided to fix it. They got enough pressure and enough people bought these things, and they were being spoken about as being terrible online so much that they finally decided to do something about it. And what they did was they effectively just rebuilt the entire application and the entire API from the ground up. So the new application was called the Nissan Connect EV app. And even though it has the exact same functionality, it was just literally a rebuild of the same thing. It had exactly the same functions inside it. The only main difference was that this was now a JSON API, so they came into the 21st century and stopped using XML. It was released in December 2015. Now, most users, myself included, didn't get this until January last year. So this application is only a year old now. Most people got it at the very start of the new year last year. As a result of that, it had very limited exposure. This is a brand new application, a brand new API that's just hit the internet. It's probably not even been pen tested, if we're being honest. And as a result of that, it was very, very young. But I can tell you that it was definitely not secure. Unlike the CarWings system, we're going to look at the problem that we found in the Nissan Connect API now. The interesting thing that I found with the Nissan Connect system was that it didn't talk to Nissan anymore. The smartphone application did not communicate with Nissan. It communicated with a company, a Japanese company called Navi. And they actually make what they call the infotainment system, so like the sat-nav and the touchscreen and all the kind of control system in the center of the car. So it looked like they'd outsourced this, and outsourcing everything is always a really good idea. The really weird part was that I thought this was going to be a new API, and this API would talk with the vehicle. But what actually happens is they set up this new API. The new smartphone application now talks to this. The Navi API then talks to the original CarWings API, which sends an SMS to the car, which dials back. So they just introduced like this extra link in the chain. I wasn't expecting this, and we know this to be the case, and we can prove this because you can still actually talk directly to the CarWings API if you want to, which is quite interesting. So they kind of introduced this extra step here, and as you'll see as we go through, this, just as a point to note, is where I believe that the problem was introduced. Now, as a hacker, as an attacker, we want to somehow get into this system. We want to see what it's doing in order to explore it and have a look at the traffic. And like all good kind of hackers and researchers, we're really lazy and want to go for the easiest way to do that. And the easiest place that we can insert ourselves into the communications is on this very first hop between the smartphone application and the Navi API. Because we control this device at the end here. So we can compromise this device, install like an SSL root certificate, and do some traffic interception to look at what commands are coming in and out of the device. To do this anywhere else in that diagram would be really difficult. Again, we'd need GSM base stations, or we'd need to be an internet service provider. So this is the easiest opportunity that we have to look into the traffic going between, ultimately, the phone and the car at the other end. To do that, there's many different tools that you can use. I use a tool called Fiddler, which is an intercepting proxy. If I'm on Windows, if I'm on Mac or Linux, I usually use Burp Suite, but there's plenty of others like Zap as well. This is basically, if you kind of followed along with the Snowden revelations a few years ago, this is effectively you becoming a little miniature NSA for just your phone. And if you saw the Snowden revelations and all the stuff that came out, I borrowed this little snippet from the NSA's actual slides to say SSL added and removed here. So the communications come out of the phone into Fiddler, which is installed on my laptop. Fiddler then decrypts that, it can read a copy of the communications, and then it re-encrypts it and sends it on to Navi. So it's completely transparent to both parties. Neither party knows this is happening, but it's only possible because I control this phone and I can configure it to do so. So once we're actually inside the communications of the application, we need to now start executing commands within the app itself and then looking at the traffic that comes in and out of the phone to start to see how this system works. And the very first thing that you do when you open the phone is that you have to log in. You have to authenticate yourself against the API. So we're going to start looking at the actual traffic captures that we got from Fiddler now, from within the encrypted communications. So this is the very first request that the application sends once you have logged in. Now, first important thing to note is that this is a GET request. For those of you that understand the significance of that, you'll know why this is important. The rest of this is effectively just an address that you could paste in the address bar of any web browser. It's just one big long address. I've broken it out into multiple lines purely for readability. So you can see the subdomain and the domain it's hitting here. We've got /orchestration/GDC, and we're hitting an endpoint called user login request. So we've just logged in on the app, and we're now seeing a login request or a request to a login endpoint going across the wire. This is all pretty kind of expected so far. The parameters that it sends with it, the region code. So I did some research on this. It turns out there's 4 different region codes. The N stands for Nissan, and then they have E for Europe, like NA for North America, I think it's like C for Canada, and something else. Language, ENGB, not particularly important. This DCMID value was the first value that we came across that we didn't know. If memory serves me, I think it was a 12-digit number, but we'll talk about it a little bit more specifically later. The VIN number, every vehicle has a VIN number. You can walk up to a car and literally read it off the window on the front. It's just a serial number for the car off the production line, nothing particularly important. Time zone, even though I'm in the UK, is always Europe, Paris. And then the 2 that we'd expect to see, the user ID and the password. So these are the actual things that we really want to be sending to the API in order to authenticate ourselves. So this request comes through from the phone into Fiddler. I allow this to pass to the API. The API receives that, and then the API responds back to me with the JSON payload. Now I've cut this payload down. This payload was like crazy massive. I don't even know why it was as big as it was, but it contained all kinds of information about me, my account, the vehicle, specific components in the vehicle. It had a lot of information in there. But the main thing that we were looking for, considering we've just sent an authentication request, was something like this, a session ID or some kind of session token that we can then use on subsequent requests to persist our authenticated state against the API. So up until this point, everything looked kind of normal. We've sent an authentication request, we've provided our user credentials, and we've received a response that contains a session token. All looks good. Next thing to do is to actually try and activate something in the car. First thing that we wanted to try and do was turn on the climate control and turn on the heating and the fans. So we went to the appropriate screen in the smartphone application and hit the climate control on button. And this was the request that then went through. So same subdomain address and path again, except this time we're hitting an endpoint called AC remote request. Again, all looks good. And we've got all the parameters that we kind of saw earlier, or most of them. Remember, look through the parameter list there. Remember that this is a GET request. So that means that these parameters are the only parameters that were sent with the request. So this was kind of the first odd thing for us, really. But we sent this request, we allowed it to pass through our intercepting proxy. It hits the API, and then the API sends back a nice little JSON payload again. Status 200, success message, passes us our user ID and the VIN number back. This result key, we won't talk about it, but basically, once you've issued a request like this, you can pull the API with the result key to say, have you passed this message to the car yet? So it's not kind of important for the research here, but you could actually find out when the Nissan servers had connected to your vehicle and delivered the command. But right now, I'm sat at my house and the air conditioning and all the heaters come on in my car outside. But we need to go back and take a closer look at that request. Now, this is a GET request, which means there's no post data payload. And for those of you wondering, there's nothing in the request headers whatsoever. The application wasn't sending any data in the request headers. So we're saying to this AC remote request endpoint, I want you to turn on the air conditioning in a car. And the only information I'm giving it are these parameters here. Region code language, DCMID, which we still didn't know what was, the VIN, the time zone, and the user ID and the car type.
No password.
No password, and no session token either. This was a GET request. It's not in the request headers. This was literally the only thing that the application was sending to the car. Now that's worrying as it is, because technically if anybody was to copy and paste that address into their browser or manually fire this GET request from any tool that they wanted, this would actually turn on the air conditioning in my car, and you could take control of that particular feature. But there were two things holding you back. The first of them was this DCM ID value. Now I did some research online looking at the different things inside the car, and I've not had this confirmed because nobody at Nissan likes me and will talk to me, but I think that this is the digital communications modem ID. Looking at the parts that are in the car and this number, I think it was a 12-digit number again, but it looked like the serial number for something, and I think it was the digital communications modem ID. The main thing here, though, is that it's difficult to get. If you wanted to send this request and activate the air conditioning in my car, you'd need this really long number. The second thing that you would also need is my user ID. Now, if you're a European customer like I am, your user ID is actually a username that you pick, but like probably everybody else, I have the same username everywhere. It's just my name, Scott Helme, so it's not particularly difficult to get. If you're anywhere else apart from Europe, this is just your email address. So again, not particularly difficult to get. If you're good at social engineering or doing research online, I can pretty much guarantee that you'll be able to find this quite easily for somebody's car. It's not going to be difficult to figure out their username or their email address if they're a non-European customer. But this DCM ID value is a problem. Again, if I remember correctly, it was very long, in the order of like 10 or 12 digits. So for you to issue that many requests against the API and try and brute force this number, I mean, it'd take a really long time, and you'd probably knock over Nissan servers in the process anyway, because they're not going to be able to take that many requests while you try and guess this value. So at this point, you'd be kind of stuck. All you need to do is fill these two fields, and you can then issue these requests to take control of the feature in my car, but I couldn't think how to get this other value. So I spent some time looking into this and Googling around, and then I kind of got a bit bored and a bit annoyed, and like all good hackers, I was like, well, let's just screw around with it and see what happens. So what I actually did was I deleted these two values, shrank the request, fired that, and the API responded with a success message. So this was like, you know, typical hacker mindset, just like delete them and send some like malformed request. Oh, it worked. Like, great. This is, I mean, this is good depending on your viewpoint. Again, I say good a lot because I like breaking things, but this is terrible if you're an innocent person. But the other really interesting thing to note here is that the user ID was a field that I dropped out of the request, but it was still included in the response. So I've now taken the user ID out of the request and effectively just hit the API with a VIN number that has then given me back the owner's name or email address of that vehicle. So we've already got like our second series problem really, because the first one is that you can now control the stuff within my car, and the second one is that you can now find out who I am just from the VIN number of my car, because that was the only request parameter that was actually linked to me and required. So this was a really big problem straight away. So I went back and thought, okay, I didn't need the DCM ID or the user ID. Do I need the language? Do I need the time zone? And do I need this car type value? The car type field was empty for most of the time that I looked at it anyway. It just seemed to decide whether or not to send it based on what day it was. So I looked at all those and thought, well, does it really need those? So I took those out, shrank the request down, fired it again, and it responded back with another success message. So we effectively cut this right down to just the region code and the VIN for the car. And from some unofficial source who might not work at Nissan told me the region code is required so they can route the SMS to the appropriate continent. So when they try and send the SMS to the car, they need to know which region's node to deliver that command to SMS the vehicle. And then the VIN number is obviously just the unique identifier for the particular vehicle. So with literally just the VIN number and knowing which continent my vehicle is on, you can now take control of all of the remotely accessible features within my car. And at this point we were really quite excited because Troy was sat in Australia like that, turning things on and off inside my car. He had full remote control of the application. Anything that the application could do, he could now do because the authentication mechanism was completely broken. So turning the aircon on and off, or the heated seats, or the heated steering wheel, things like that, that's quite interesting. And, you know, it could be a bit of an inconvenience because they could turn it on all day and perhaps, you know, run my battery out. But it wasn't, you know, it wasn't like activating the brakes or anything like that. So it wasn't as serious as it could have been. And it's a really good job that the smartphone application didn't have remote unlock because this would also be compromised at that point as well. So we decided to have a click around the application and see what other functions and features were inside the app. Now, there is one kind of area within the app where you can ask it to generate a graph of your driving history to show like how far you've gone and how economical you were driving. And when you do any interactions with that graph, it issues a request against price simulator detail info request. I've already cut these requests down now. They were the same with all the parameters. So from now on, I've just cut out all the rubbish that we don't need. So you needed the region code and the VIN for my car. And the only additional parameter for this one was the month that you wanted the data for. So you could get the current month, the previous month, whenever you want, and fire this request against the Nissan Connect API. Now I've cut this one down because the payload that was returned here was even bigger. And what this included was basically a JSON payload with every single journey that my vehicle had ever taken that month in it. Every single time I turned my car on to when I turned it off was logged as a trip in this JSON payload. And the only thing that you needed to pull this back from the API was the VIN number for my vehicle. So you could walk past my car, look into my windscreen, get the VIN number, and then download a list of every single trip that me or anyone who's driven my car has ever taken. So this was like the second really serious privacy thing for me, was that I didn't want people to have access to this kind of information. This is starting to get into creepy territory now. It would literally ID the trips per day. Electric mileage was the economy that the vehicle achieved. It would give you the travel distance exactly in yards. So this was just over 1 mile, or like 1.2 km. So it was just like a quick nip down the road. And it would actually give you an exact GPS date time stamp of the time that you started that journey. So you can start to do things like watching what time a particular person sets off to work, what time they set home from work. You can see that if I drive exactly 30 miles from my house, you can probably have a pretty good guess where on that 30-mile radius that I stopped my car. The only thing that this data was missing was the actual GPS coordinates. So I want to be clear, in this particular payload, there were no GPS coordinates. But you can still glean an awful lot of information out of this, because you can extract my user ID, which is my username and my email, and then a history of every single trip that I've ever taken. And all you would need to do is issue 2 GET requests against the API. So whilst we were going through the responsible disclosure process for this, Nissan announced that they were going to do a press statement, and I got very happy thinking, finally they're taking us seriously and they're actually going to do something and maybe turn this API off or fix it or whatever it was. But actually they just wanted to announce a new feature in their broken application, was that they were going to introduce live GPS tracking into the Nissan Connect EV application. So you could literally open it up. There's also a web portal version of this as well, but we only looked at the Nissan Connect EV app, and you could basically press the button and say, where is my car right now? And when I first presented this research, I did it, and you can literally see, I don't know what the accuracy is, but it looks pretty accurate to me, probably within a meter or two of where the car is at the time that you made the request. So again, it sends an SMS to the car, asks it to wake up, and then says, send me your GPS location, where are you right now? So coupled with the previous one, this then becomes basically full-blown GPS tracking of you at any point that somebody should so wish to see where you were. This was going kind of way past creepy now, and there's 2 ways that an attacker could use this. They could either walk past your car, so I could pick someone in the audience, follow you out to your car, and look at your VIN number. I can then track you specifically as a person in a targeted fashion. Or VIN numbers are sequential. They're just the serial number off the production line. So the first car off gets number 1, and then they just count upwards. As long as you can count from 1 to 1,000,000, you can enumerate them all. I'm pretty sure most of us could probably manage that. So if you wanted to, you could either track a single person, or, and of course this is entirely hypothetical and we did not do this, you could actually try and GPS locate the entire Nissan fleet if you wanted to, by just enumerating each VIN number one after the other and saying, where is this car, where is this car, where is this car, and then drop a pin on the map for each one. Totally ethical, did not do that. That is 100% not real. So yeah, at this point, we'd already started the responsible disclosure process with Nissan at this point, and we were already going through it when they announced this press release. Usual story with researchers, they didn't do anything. I'll come on to that later. But now that we got to this level of creepy and live GPS tracking was coming, I then went to what we call the Information Commissioner's Office in the United Kingdom. Now, the ICO is a government body that's set up to enforce what we have is the Data Protection Act, and also any freedom of information requests. So these are the guys that are supposed to hold companies to account when they do bad things with your data. I don't know of anybody that's had a good story to tell about the ICO, and unfortunately mine is no different. So I presented all of our research to the ICO, told them exactly what was possible and how simple it was. Like, you can literally copy and paste these GET requests into a browser. You don't even need to use a tool. You could literally just edit the address bar and do this. So this was really about as basic as it could possibly get. And the ICO responded to me and said, Nissan have explained that whilst they did identify some vulnerability in the Nissan Connect EV smartphone application, this would not provide access to personal information unless the individual has prior knowledge of the car owner. Now, the VIN numbers are numeric. I can just cycle through them and extract your user ID, which is either your username or your email. And that's pretty much going to identify most people off the bat, and I would consider to be personal information. Then there's your driving log, so I can see every single trip you've ever taken in your car, and then with the new feature, I can GPS locate your car at any given point in time. But none of that is personal information. That's totally not personal, apparently. Same email. So these were quoted verbatim from one email, all these quotes that you're about to look at. Further down the same email. In light of this, we've decided that it is unlikely that Nissan has complied with the requirements of the DPA. This is because Nissan has failed to keep personal information secure. Same email. So it's not personal information, but they didn't keep personal information secure. Total contradiction in the same email body. So at this point, I was like, oh, actually, this has turned slightly for the better. They're saying Nissan haven't done what they're supposed to do, which is to keep personal information secure. The ICO have a really big tendency of just not doing anything about anything. So I thought, oh, wow, this is actually taking a turn for the better. So you get an email, right? It starts out bad. And then in the middle, it kind of gets better, and you think, oh, this is about to go my way. What's the next word that you don't want at the start of the next paragraph? However, and I was like, so as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, close the email, that's it. They're not going to do anything. But I decided to quote the rest of it for you anyway. So in light of the steps Nissan have taken to update this service and the additional security they put in place, they didn't. No further action is required at this time. So to me, what this message says is that if you're a car manufacturer or any kind of online application whatsoever, you can pretty much have as terrible security as you want. You don't need to secure these systems, and eventually, when a security researcher comes along, or if a security researcher comes along and finds these gaping flaws in your system, as long as you kind of do something about it when you get around to it, then the ICO pretty much aren't going to do anything because you fixed it. This to me sends completely the wrong message. I was really disappointed with this. I contested the ICO's decision, but they were adamant that they did not need to do anything because Nissan had patched this. All Nissan did, they didn't implement extra security. All they did was check for the session ID, the authentication token, which they should have been looking for in the first instance. So I was really disappointed with this outcome. It basically means that this happened and there were no consequences or repercussions for Nissan, at least in like a formal or business or monetary capacity. Anyway, so some key points from the hack. The biggest one for me was that press release kind of halfway through that they were introducing to the application was live GPS tracking. There's a million different ways that could be terrible. You could be a vulnerable person and some crazy stalker could get your VIN number and then just literally live GPS locate you to come follow you around and harass you. If you're a person of interest, maybe you're a politician or some like rich CEO or whatever, again, I'm pretty sure there's lots of people that would love to have access to your real-time location data via an anonymous web API. Interestingly, I did some digging around in the warranty document because I was a bit worried about some of the stuff that I was doing anyway, like dismantling half of my car, but I could actually void your warranty by abusing this API. Now, the car basically has a giant lithium-ion battery pack underneath it. It's the size of a small suitcase. And like lithium-ion batteries in any device, like your smartphones, your laptops, they don't like what we call high SOC charging. SOC, S-O-C, is state of charge. It's basically the percentage your battery's at. So if you take your laptop or your phone, charge it to 100% and allow it to run down to, say, 95, and then charge it again, if you repeat that cycle, you will very quickly start to trash your battery. You will cause it harm because the chemistry of the batteries simply aren't compatible. They're designed to be run up and down, and they don't like being at high states of charge. So what I did, I wrote a Python script that would connect to a vehicle, and most people like me, when they get home at night, plug their car into the wall. So when they come out in the morning, it's full. So I wrote a Python script that would target a specific car. It would connect to the car and look at the car's battery and say, okay, this car's 80% and it's on charge. It should be 100% in however long. And it would keep polling back to see when the vehicle reached 100%. when it hits 100%, the charger will turn off because it's full. I would then activate any system that I could to start draining the battery and pulling the power down. Once it got back down to 95%, I think I did, I would then turn all the systems off and turn the charger back on, charge your car back up to 100. Then the charger would turn off and I repeat the cycle. And I could just keep making your car go between 95 and 100% whilst it's in the garage, on the drive, wherever, overnight. And if you do that enough times, there is actually a specific clause in Nissan's warranty that voids the warranty for the battery, which is basically the most expensive component in the vehicle, and effectively your car is worthless. So I could void your warranty as well. Complete side note, I just wanted to, see what interesting things I could do to cause problems for people. The other thing, this was a brand new app. Like I said, this came out in January last year. So when this came out, this wasn't some archaic system that they'd left online and forgotten about for 5 years. This was a brand new application. And they're like, yes, we've built this, we've done it, ship it. Oops, it's completely broken. So, remember that. The CarWings system's been around for 5 or 6 years or however long it is now. This was brand new. This had just been built. And it was largely because the API was built without authentication. It at no point checked for any kind of session ID or authentication token. It wasn't tied to the smartphone app in any way. You could literally copy and paste these addresses, and we did this in the live demos. You could copy and paste that address and give it to somebody in the audience and say, you paste that into your browser, and my car's air conditioning over there will turn on. So there was absolutely no ties whatsoever to that GET request. As a result of that, I kind of feel bad calling this hacking, really, because we didn't really bypass any security. We didn't really hack anything. I don't like that word anyway, but we didn't bypass anything. We didn't break anything. The person that found this just realized that it was broken by design. This is actually how this system was built. So very strong term to use hacking here. More like just exploratory testing, to put a more suitable title on that. And the previous version didn't have this. After we did all of this research against the Nissan Connect API, I went back and revisited all of my work against the CarWings API to see if I'd missed anything or to see if some of this new information would be useful. And as far as I could tell, the CarWings system is still solid. I still haven't found any problem with the CarWings API whatsoever. It still looks pretty solid. And the last thing that I did was I measured how much power my HVAC or my AC unit in my car ran, figured out how many cars responded to VIN numbers on Nissan's API. I looked up online how many cars Nissan had sold, and then I did some math on, if I could turn on every single air conditioning for every Nissan VIN number that's registered right now, I could burn, that's probably about 50,000 euros, I think. I could burn 50,000 euros an hour of power from everybody's car, just for fun. There's no other reason for that. So, because of course we're responsible and ethical researchers, we went through a responsible disclosure process with Nissan. And Nissan actually have a really cool team. Well, they have a cool name. Nissan have a team with a really cool name called the Information Security Threat Intelligence Team in the USA. And that sounds really awesome for a team that does nothing. So I was really disappointed that a team with that kind of name wasn't super on the ball with this. Full disclosure went to them on the 23rd of Jan, and then we did public disclosure on the 24th of February. Now, for responsible disclosure, that's quite a tight deadline. Typically, even Google's Project Zero give 90 days. The only reason that we went public on a much shorter timescale is that once we started to pull this apart, and once you know what kind of things to Google for, like the domain of the API or the payloads or things like that, once you start whacking them in Google and you see things popping up on forums on dark corners of the web, the cat's out the bag. And we were like, we've started to see evidence of this online now. We've actually found forum posts with this data in them. So it's already out there. It's already public domain. Technically, we didn't make it public. We just made it a lot more public than it was because it was already indexed on Google. So 4 weeks and 4 days after the first disclosure, Troy has more details on his blog if you want to go and read them there. But typically, again, responsible disclosure, working with a big company like this, we sent 23rd of January with full details to Nissan, and we only went public on the 24th of Feb, as I said, because we found evidence that this information was already online. During this entire timeline, despite the fact that we identified this and proven this and demonstrated this, Nissan didn't think it was suitable to pull their API down. They were happy to leave this API endpoint stood up where potentially anybody with just a VIN number could go and download all of the information, your name or your email address, your trip data. They could do all of this stuff. It was completely unauthenticated and sat on the open web. And Nissan didn't think that this was a big enough kind of risk to their customers. They weren't too concerned about this. Funny story, this got a lot of attention, and on the 25th of February it hit the BBC headlines, which is so funny, exactly the same day that Nissan decided that they needed to take this API down to protect their customers. So again, for those of you that have ever been involved in security research or a responsible disclosure process, you will know exactly how this works and that this is a pretty typical thing. Whilst it's private between you and the company that you're dealing with, they don't have any pressures whatsoever. As soon as they're making BBC headlines, they need to look like they're doing the right thing. And literally, as the BBC were going through this process, rather than say there is a vulnerable system, it was changed to Nissan have disabled a vulnerable system, and they pulled it down. It wasn't until we got the clout of a BBC headline that Nissan would do that. And this is, again, a constant thing in the security research community and happens to me on every single one of these responsible disclosures that I do. Companies and organizations will not take action until basically you hit them in the pocket or their reputation's on the line. We are getting better at this as an industry, but this is still very much so the case out there. So that's the story, start to end on the Nissan hack. And there's one more thing. For those of you that have a really keen eye, when I was going through the traffic captures, the requests and the responses from the Nissan API, so when we were hitting like the remote authentication endpoint, you will have noticed actually that the file extensions on the API endpoints were .php, which means that my car is literally controlled by PHP. Thank you very much. Hopefully there's some questions because I left time. Yes?
Did you tell your wife before you pulled the car apart?
No, I just told her it was broken already and I was trying to fix it. That was the best thing I could think of to tell her. But yeah, she's still really cross at me. I'm glad she doesn't come to these things. Any more? Oh, I was hoping for a couple. Yes, sorry.
Did you lock and unlock the car through the API?
No, so again, depending on your viewpoint, the question now is can you do unlock and lock commands? No, and it's probably a good job given how easy this was. And I guess, I can't really see the point in remote unlock and lock commands anyway. Remote heating and things like that, yes. And this is just something that we need to be aware of in the broader kind of concern here is that as we add more features to these smartphone applications and make more of these features remotely accessible, that also makes them remotely attackable. We saw the stuff that Anders showed us with Chris Valasek and Charlie Miller. I followed their stuff quite closely. And a lot of the time, they were doing really cool stuff with the Jeep, where they were actually like reflashing devices within the car to move laterally inside the car's internal networks and stuff. This was literally an exposed web API. There was like zero kind of technical hacking here at all, really. Again, car manufacturers are getting better at this stuff and they're starting to take it more seriously, but we do need to have this constant awareness that all of these systems can be prodded and poked by anybody that has an internet connection. Yes?
Did they do anything more than just...
No, because that's all it needed. That's all that was missing. And I said, actually, I hinted at where I think that this issue came from. Was in the diagram right back at the beginning. I'm not sure about this because I was speaking to somebody inside Nissan under agreement of anonymity. And, gosh, this is a really long presentation. No. I think that my understanding of the very limited information that I have was that the lack of authentication came in here. So obviously Navi is somehow permanently authenticated to the Nissan API, and I guess maybe they thought Navi was authenticating the external user. So somehow in here, authentication got missed. Maybe one person thought the other was authenticating users or not, but if Navi's permanently authenticated against Nissan, then any request they receive that is passed through will carry their authentication. That's a total guess on my part and my understanding of the best of it. Otherwise, I can't see how you'd miss this.
When was the GPS live tracking feature introduced?
I guess that was about 3 weeks after our initial disclosure. So, like roughly, the actual...
It was within that 4 week?
Yes, it was within that timeline because I thought they were going to do an announcement about what we'd found. Silly thought that was. They were just announcing more broken features. There. So that's the actual press release that they did. If you want to go and have a look at that, it will probably be dated But it was definitely within that window anyway. I remember that for sure. Yes?
Did the reliability of the app actually improve by
Yes, so yeah, Nissan Connect has been pretty solid. I have scripts now that poll both CarWings and Nissan Connect to A, monitor uptime, and B, see if I can find new API endpoints before they're exposed publicly. Completely ethically, I do that, of course. Said that on camera, oops. But yeah, no, Nissan Connect is really good now. It's pretty, I've not seen any notable problems. So on the bright side, they did fix the original thing that Nissan Connect was meant to fix, which was to make it reliable. They just made it unsecure. Any more questions? We good? All right, well, thank you very much then.
Excellent, thank you.